Hello all and welcome to History with R&R Live. Hopefully everybody's weekend was well. It is Monday morning. We have a few channel admin that I'll get to at the end of the show, but first of all, how are we doing, Jeff?
Well, we're on time today.
Yeah,
I think the
I
last couple weeks we
know.
started a little late, so
Yeah, I'm
we're
on
doing
time.
great today.
It should go down in history. Anyway.
historical
Mhm.
point in history.
All right,
Yes.
so quickly before we bring up our guest for this morning, I want to say hello to Thomas Potts, who is in the chat. And there's no point in battling the French. They're Thomas. You know, they just have a long pole with a white flag at the end of it. Mrs. Canuck, welcome, my love. John DeMarco, welcome. Number one sci-fi. Bird of Prey 5, Kapla. And to everyone else, welcome this morning. This morning we had originally had a show, and then as I still slept, everything changed. So a big thank you to Jeff Franklin and my love for contacting me, and Jeff for doing the legwork and bringing us our guest today, John DeMarco. Welcome to the channel, sir.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome, John.
Thank you.
You really helped us out today. We
Yes,
appreciate it.
thank you. Nothing like
No
the
problem.
short notice. All right.
And good morning, Cinnabon.
Oh, good morning, sir. And again, Cinnabon, I know it's been a minute, but condolences once again for the cute bunny that made us all laugh many times. Um, but okay, moving on. As I spaced there for a second, sorry. John DeMarco, I'll let you lead us off, and we'll go where you lead, sir.
Thank you. All I thought about talking about today was the origins of the Anabaptist movement. Well, that term may not be familiar to some people. If you heard of the Amish or the Mennonite, that's where their history started, so to speak, during the Protestant Reformation. Most people have heard of Martin Luther, how he nailed the 95 Theses to the church door as a criticism of some of the things he disagreed with in Catholicism, such as the selling of indulgences, where basically is where you could pay money to the church to do basically as a get out of jail free card for things you've done wrong. And so during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had been probably the most dominant force in European society. And so when people like Martin Luther and others started posting these criticisms of the Catholic Church, some of the political leaders latched onto this because they saw it as an excuse to try to, break the monopoly held by the church, plus getting in on all of the wealth that the church had. So after that, you had eventually would be called Protestant leaders popping up in different parts of Europe. And one of these leaders was named Ulrich Zwingli, who was located in Zurich, Switzerland. And like Luther, he preached against a lot of the traditional practices of the Catholic Church, and he won the support of the city council, which at first supported him for the various political reasons for breaking away from the Catholic Church, although other areas of Switzerland would still be considered loyal to Catholicism. Another thing that Luther and Zwingli, people like them, had in common is that they believed in using the power of the state to bring about reformation in the church, because throughout the medieval, Europe, the union of church and state was considered a given. That they would have a hard time even understanding the concept of them being separate.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times their political leaderships would go hand in hand with the religious reformations for the changes they wanted to implement. Zwingli followed that similar pattern in Zurich. He would preach some radical reforms, but if the city council didn't agree with it, he would kind of back off and compromise. So he would basically keep them on his side.
Yes.
So Zwingli, some of the radical things he taught attracted some other believers to Zurich. They eventually, because these people wanted a more radical break from the Catholic Church, and Zwingli was more of a compromiser. So eventually they came into conflict because they didn't believe in compromising to basically so that you didn't upset
Yes.
the civil
It's
rulers.
always a problem. Yeah.
So some of these people, they would meet on their own to study the Bible, and they would come to conclusions that the civil rulers didn't like. And one of the major issues was the idea of infant baptism, which that had been common throughout the Middle Ages as well. And
Right.
it was still believed in by most of the Protestant reformers, wherein every infant had to be baptized into whatever the state religion was. It was compulsory. There was no choice.
Yeah.
And even throughout the Reformation, when there were different areas of breaking away from Catholic control, they would still practice infant baptism. Just you would be baptized into whatever the dominant religion was for the state.
Yeah.
But the people who would eventually be called Anabaptists disagreed with this, and that's where they're given their name, because it means basically rebaptizers.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't believe in compulsory baptism or infant baptism in general. They believe it should be practiced voluntarily when you're old enough to understand what you're doing.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
right.
That is the crux of the argument because it rages on to this day. Yes.
Yes.
I was just going to mention that. It certainly does.
Yes. So eventually the city rulers told them basically to cease and desist preaching this because it was some of them went so far as to consider them anarchists because they just couldn't understand why you would basically want to separate from the authority of the state. Because the baptism was one example of them believing that the church should be independent of the state and should be only filled with people who basically wanted to be there, not where there was an official state religion that everyone who lived there was forced to be a part of. So eventually, the rulers in Zurich ruled that that every infant had to be baptized because some of the Anabaptists were starting to refuse to baptize their babies, and that they were no longer allowed to meet in private for these Bible studies. They were producing all these dangerous ideas.
Yes.
And I looked up the date. There was apparently a meeting on January 21st, 1525, after the rules had been laid down that they had to basically cease and desist, where some of the early leaders of the Anabaptist movement, there's names such as Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz, they all met together, decided what to do, decided they have to follow what their conscience told them to do, despite what the religious and political rulers were saying. So they all baptized each other as adults, and they went on and started preaching their beliefs from there. And at first, that the civil rulers and the religious leaders like Zwingli opposed them, like would throw them in prison, would forbid them from preaching, would try to exile them. But after they realized that that wasn't sufficient, that the people were still going out and preaching anyway, they'd break out of prison and so on. By 1527, which was a couple of years later, they started executing them if they refused to give up their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Like Felix Manz was one of the first ones who was executed. They threw him into the river in Zurich for refusing to give up his beliefs. And over time, this would be common as the movement spread throughout Central Europe or Eastern Europe and so on. Whether it was in a Protestant or a Catholic territory, whenever the Anabaptists would spring up, the authorities would try to stamp them out because they considered them a disruptive influence. I've got a book here. It's called The Martyr's Mirror. It was written by, I think it was written in the 1660s. Just let's try to get the glare off of it. You can see here, it's about the size of a phone book.
Yes.
Yes, it's
Mhm.
It is a tale written by an Anabaptist describing like the persecution of Christians throughout history, and of course with this particular focus on the Anabaptists who were imprisoned or killed for their faith. And one of the reasons it's so thick is he includes lots of like letters and accounts of them when they're in prison. They'd write letters to their family or
Well, of course.
their church and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's how we know a lot about the history from books like that.
So, just to sidebar, just kind of fill people in a little bit. You know, most people sit there today and go, well, how could they do all this? You have to remember the church back then and the church today are two separate entities.
Yes.
at that point, the Pope had an army, a standing army, in most countries in Europe that would be called to his banner at any moment, which is why kings usually had to do as the Pope said, because, well, most of their army was also part of the papacy.
Yes, and one of the reasons the Anabaptists were seen as such a threat is that they were considered as the eternal distraction. For example, when you had Protestants and Catholics threatening to go to war with each other, so they
Yes.
both had their armies. Like even within Switzerland, parts of it were Protestant, parts of it were Catholic. So there was always a threat of
Northern and Southern Ireland.
right. Plus, also on the eastern borders, you had the threat of the Muslims invading from Turkey, and so the Anabaptists were considered an internal threat because of that as well, especially since the Anabaptists typically taught non-resistance, which is essentially not fighting back against people who are oppressing you, persecuting you, and so on.
Yes.
I'm trying to think where I want to go next with this.
So here's a question, kind of a sidebar.
Yes.
Did the move King Henry VIII made help or detract from the cause? Which is when King Henry VIII took England from a Catholic realm to a Protestant realm with him at the head.
I don't think it necessarily helped per se because, yes, he did break off from the Catholic Church, but like with many other Catholic or Protestant countries, you still had to be part of the state religion.
Yeah,
really
either Catholic or Protestant, yeah.
Right.
And then when King Henry VIII did his move, it was more you were Protestant.
Right.
Because...
just replacing one with another, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, and he put himself at the head instead of the Pope.
Yes, and there was never much Anabaptist activity in England that I'm aware of.
Okay.
A lot of it was centered around the Central Europe area, like around Switzerland.
Okay.
There was another stronghold in the Netherlands, which is actually where the name Mennonite comes from. There was an early leader named Menno Simons who lived up there. Plus, there was also some a stronghold in Moravia, which is near what we now call like Czech Republic and Slovakia. There was a branch of the movement there called Hutterites that practiced communal living, and there's still some of them living in the various parts of the United States and Canada.
Okay. So, with the movement, when does it start to become accepted? I guess that would be much further on, or
yeah, typically much later. At first, wherever they went, they were persecuted.
okay,
So much so that some of the groups they were so heavily persecuted. In some cases, they made agreements for where they went that with the authorities basically will let you live here if you basically keep quiet about your beliefs. So that's where a lot of them ended up after being persecuted for so long. Although one of the first places they were really accepted was actually in was then the colonies in the what later became the United States. Because in particular in Pennsylvania, which was founded by William Penn, who was a Quaker, who had some similar beliefs with the Anabaptists, such as basically toleration of other religions. And you don't all have to be part of the same church. So basically, he offered them a place for them to come where they'd be relatively free from persecution. So a lot of them emigrated to Pennsylvania and the surrounding areas during the colonial period.
Okay.
And that's why today, the majority of the people who identify as Anabaptists are in the United States. A lot of them came over during that period, eventually spread out from there.
Well, of course, yeah. And then we have some up here, I believe, as well. So
yeah, I think so.
Well, I was just going to ask if it was reversed at some point where they started to spread out to other areas, other countries. And it sounds like you have some in Canada.
yes, yeah. Now, I guess during the persecutions, which is odd if you stop to think about it. You'd think the last people who would do it would be, the religions, because, well, it wasn't that long ago, I mean, in history terms, that they were all prosecuted, whether Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, Anglican, United, doesn't really matter. They were all considered against the state at one point. Just talk to Rome. But it happened a lot more than what we think, and from within as well. I mean, a lot of this period, there was being like, if you think about it in the modern lens, you ask someone a question, they can answer, "I'm Christian." You don't necessarily ask the denomination; you just take it at that value. Back then, Christian was very much defined by what that particular state believed in. So if they were Catholic and you said, "I'm Christian," that meant you were Catholic. There was no point in asking that question, because by saying that, you were Catholic, or Protestant, or Baptist, or if you go far enough in Russia, there's a few interesting sects over there. But today it's not defined. You know, you have to actually ask the question, okay, you're Christian, which denomination? Back then, there was no question. It was, okay, well, we're in a Catholic-dominated country, therefore I'm Catholic. Because to not be Catholic was a heretic. Anything but Catholicism was a heretic. Anything other than Protestant, in a Protestant-dominated area, was heresy. I mean, people of not just the peasantry, but royalty, lords. They a few of their heads rolled because they were on the wrong side of that coin. Throughout the years, I mean, Queen Mary, Queen of Scots. Besides the fact she tried to overthrow Elizabeth, she was also the Protestant queen. So she had, or a Catholic queen, sorry. Elizabeth was the Protestant queen, daughter of King Henry VIII. So Catholicism wanted England back, so they were going to try to put Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne. And long story short, Elizabeth took her head. But so just to kind of, I say that more as to understand the time we're talking about here. This isn't modern day where, freedom of religion is taught. Freedom of religion was, you are free to be if you were in a Catholic country, you were free to be Catholic. That's about where it stops. Right? You have the freedom to be Catholic.
I don't know if that's really free, but okay.
And then in certain parts, you were free to be a certain type of Catholic.
So if you're in a Catholic, if the Catholics would kill the Protestants would kill the Catholics, then everybody would kill the Anabaptists. That's one of the things they could agree on. The Catholics and the Protestants, that the Anabaptists should be wiped out. Although one of them,
a whole lot of killing going on there.
Yes, I read a quote one time of I think it was a civil ruler somewhere during this time period, who said that basically the more we kill them, the Anabaptists, the more they multiply.
Yes.
So they kept trying to stamp them out. Sometimes they would succeed in a certain area, but then they would move to a different area, and it would just continue from there.
So, a lot of times when there's underground churches, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. There were secret signs or secret messages that sometimes hold out today, but they're not known as secret messages, but they're symbols, or the church has a few. The early church has a few, because the Romans used to like to put people on pikes. So they had secret handshakes or secret they'd make a symbol in the sand, and if the person didn't finish the symbol, they know not to talk religion, because if they did, they'd be persecuted for it. So they would make a symbol in the sand with their foot, and if the person didn't finish it off, they wouldn't go religious because it wasn't safe to do so. Did they have anything like that, or was there anything of that?
Well, I know they often had it in secret, so I imagine they did have stuff like that. I don't know of any specifics.
Okay.
There's one thing I heard about sometimes that they would gather in a house when it was still dark,
Yes.
and they would have to stay in there all day until it got dark again, so they wouldn't be seen coming or going.
Yes.
Or they would
That
be out in
was-
the woods and stuff like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That was an old tradition, actually. It goes back to the Roman times. They would they would meet, and they would be there all day, all night, because again, you can't be seen leaving, you can't be seen coming, because then, well, what are all these people? You get more than 5 people meeting, and people start raising eyebrows. So here's the biggest. Here's the question for those who are not religiously inclined. What would be the major differences between Catholicism, Protestant, and is it just the baptism, or are there other differences?
There are other differences as well. Just the baptism was one of the focuses at the time. This was got the name from there.
Okay.
Like one of the obvious differences is the authority of the Pope.
Yes.
So obviously the Protestants would rebel against that. There was things about the baptism. There was a lot of disagreements about the Mass, which is the Catholic form of worship that Protestants typically would have disagreements who would think different things in the Mass, things like prayers to saints and things like that. Those are things where Protestants and Anabaptists would be similar, but one thing where the Protestants and the Catholics would have something in common was basically the union of the church and state, at least during this time period.
Okay.
This
So
was like
their biggest, probably the to me, what it sounds like would be the baptism is the excuse for the change in baptism would be the excuse. The more problem and why they were so dangerous is the separation of church and state.
Yeah, I went back to that.
Because to separate the church from the state back then was a no-no. The church had full control to some degree, which is again why King Henry VIII had to separate from Rome, because even as king, he couldn't do what he wanted. He had to somewhat bend the knee to Rome, and he refused to do so. But I think that would make them that's what made them more dangerous, was their preaching of separation of church and state, because that's where the danger lies. Because as we find out, even in the modern day, once people get power, they don't like relinquishing it very much.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Anabaptists would say, we believe the church to be separate from the state. So that's what a lot of them heard. So you think there shouldn't be a government?
Yeah.
Like, no, that's not what we're saying, but that's a little bit thought they were anarchists, because they thought if you separate the church from the state, it means you're trying to overthrow the state.
Yeah, there is no state then.
Right.
Because back then, I mean, we tend not to think of it this way, but as I said before, we're talking about a time when the Pope had standing armies.
Mm-hmm.
Where, by order of the Pope, you could be arrested. Never mind the order of the king, the order of the Pope. And then another thing too, I mean, the church has could stop warring factions just by showing up and showing favor to one side or the other. Throughout history, it's happened where a battle was lost and nobody, as they say, fired a shot. It was just public knowledge that the church was on side with one side or the other.
Oh, we kind of saw
And-
that last week talking with Zoe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, depending on where the church fell on side, would depend where, whole armies would just disintegrate. Because if they'd go against another king, sure, no problem. But to go against the church, that was unheard of. You didn't do that because you were going to lose, guaranteed.
Yeah, the Pope disagreed with somebody, he could excommunicate a whole country or a whole region or
Yep.
something.
The Pope had enormous powers back in the day, and a lot of people don't realize the Pope, even to this day, is technically the head of the church, God's representative on earth, plus the King of Rome.
Mhm.
He
Oh,
wears
sure.
he wears several hats, which is why it's so tall.
Big. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's the head of Vatican City. Which is its own country. Go figure. Recognized by the UN. How, I don't know, but it is. And that's why certain rules can be broken once certain people reach the Vatican. But all right, I'll bring this up.
Oh, thank you. I just don't get into this whenever we had a minute.
Yep.
This is like a modern version of an image. You see the same thing on the front of the book over here. There's several illustrations in this book made for the various stories. And this is the story of a believer named Dirk Willems. He was imprisoned for being an Anabaptist, and specifically, he allowed his home to be used for the baptisms, which was a big no-no.
Okay.
So he was thrown in prison, and he was awaiting trial. And of course, he knew that if he's convicted of being an Anabaptist, it meant the stake. He was in prison during the winter, and somehow he managed to escape. And he was fleeing, but there were some guards in pursuit. So at one point, he ran across a frozen lake or a pond or something like that. And although he made it across safely, one of the people who was pursuing him fell through the ice. So what he decided to do was, instead of keep running, he turned around and pulled the guy out of the ice. Because one of the important teachings that the Anabaptists held to that also separated them from a lot of the other churches at the time was non-resistance. In other words, loving your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
So he turned around and pulled that guy out of the ice instead of letting him drown. And this guy, of course, wanted to let him go. He just saved my life. But his superiors told him that no, it's your role is to take him back into custody. So he was rearrested, and later on, he eventually was burned at the stake because he did not recant his beliefs.
Yeah.
And he's considered kind of a folk hero in that area even until this day, as I understand.
So what are the, I guess, bringing this around to modern day, what are the modern day roles of the church, and does it still have its European roots, and or is it just now more US based and those roots have all gone now?
From what I've read, that like I said, a lot of them moved to the U.S. or Canada, at those areas. There were some that stayed behind in Europe, but as I understand, the ones that stayed behind in Europe, over time, eventually moderated, so to speak, and became more like the other mainstream churches that were still in the area. So they're like not really recognizable as being any different in the modern day.
Okay. So the church moves over to the new country, less rules. They were allowed to practice a little bit more. Did the persecution follow them over, or
At first, no, because while they lived in Pennsylvania, when they ruled by the Quakers, basically the Quakers pretty much tolerated virtually any religion, so they're
okay,
basically free to practice. Although after basically at the time of the American Revolution, after the Quakers were no longer in power, there was some degree of persecution again, especially since the Anabaptists typically did not support the revolution. Because well, the most part they'd like to stay neutral, and if they were on anybody's side, they were going to be on the British side because the British basically allowed them to come over here and settle relatively free from persecution.
That's
okay,
interesting.
yeah. So they weren't on side, and they weren't on the proper side in that haircut, as we say.
So, so I
Go
have a
ahead.
question. What are the differences between the Quakers, the Amish, the Mennonites? Can you maybe go into that
Yes.
a little bit?
Well, the Amish and the Mennonites, for example, believe in following the New Testament, basically as literally as possible. But the Quakers are a little bit different. The Quakers believe in like personal revelation, and they believe that can be on the same level as Scripture. And while originally this actually led them to some of the same conclusions as the Mennonites and the Amish, it also led them down some other areas where that we would probably disagree with them, because that is kind of a fundamental difference in how you look at the Bible, which makes the Quakers kind of stand out from other more traditional Christian organizations.
Okay. So, what is the role of the modern church? Does like, because when you think Mennonite and you think, and I know I've been to a couple of Mennonite churches and I've known a few. You hear the words Mennonite or you hear Amish and you think buggy and horse-drawn carriage and no electricity and etc. etc. How much of that is actually still holds true to this day, or have they started to adapt more?
Well, there's a wide range of beliefs about that, even among Anabaptists. Like a lot of people know about the Amish because of the horse and buggy thing. Even among the Amish, there's different degrees of separation. A lot of it goes down to what they would call separation from the world, and basically an emphasis on community, which some of them, the more strict ones, would believe that modern technology destroys a sense of community, and so that's why they try to keep to a more old-fashioned lifestyle. But on the other hand, you have like more progressive Amish, if you will, or Mennonites who don't necessarily have a problem with technology. So like
Yeah,
as myself, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be on the internet.
yeah, it's exactly. Yes. Yeah, because I've always found that interesting how, you know, we tend to pigeonhole people into, well, if you say that you are Catholic, then you must follow A B C D E F. What do you mean you're Catholic and you don't this? That
Mm-hmm.
doesn't compute. You.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're not. You know what I mean? We put people in little boxes, neat little boxes, and if they don't conform to the box, then there's something wrong. Um, but yeah, without understanding that it's much deeper than that, because you have uh, several different ways of looking at the same book without being able to go, well, this is right, this is wrong. Um, so under the modern guys, um, is it still just the main thing is that you're not baptized as a child, you're baptized much older, whereas in Catholicism you're baptized at and Protestant, to be quite honest, you're baptized as a child and then you go for the I forget what they call
Confirmation.
it. Confirmation when you're about 12, 13.
Yeah, that is still like one of our key beliefs, although that doesn't set us apart as much now as it used to, because there are lots of other religions that also believe in, like, they don't believe in infant baptism, they believe you're supposed to be grown up. In the United States, most of the persecution towards Anabaptists has come for their basically refusal to participate in fighting in wars.
Okay.
The Revolution, the Civil War, and so on. They would refuse to fight for either side typically, and sometimes that would get them in trouble.
Yeah, that would.
Mr. CCDV said something interesting in chat. He said that what he finds interesting about the Quakers is they're exclusively nonviolent, but they are allowed to serve in the military.
Yes, there are some groups, some Christian groups, such as the Quakers, who, while they don't believe in fighting per se, they accept a non-combatant status in the military if they were to get drafted, for example. Although typically Anabaptists would refuse even non-combatant status because they consider it as still service to the military, even if you're not actually fighting.
I know that one of the ways around that was MedCorps. You'd find a lot of people of that area, if they were, if they had no choice, they'd go MedCorps. There's a lot of stories, especially World War II during the draft, where that would be where they'd end up in. And there's this wonderful story, and I can't remember the name of it, but there was a movie done about it, and it happened in Okinawa, where one of the medics, he joins the military, and because he has no choice, he's drafted, and he joins the MedCorps because he goes to training and they go to hand him a gun and he won't pick it up. He won't practice shoot. He won't, none of that. He won't pick up a gun. So he gets beaten up. He gets harassed by his fellow soldiers, and his life is all in all not a very good one. And then he gets to Okinawa and he receives medals of honor for how many men he pulled off the front line. And the way he does it, or the way he has to do it, is they're up on a hill, like up on a cliff at the top, and the rest of the army's at the bottom. And he climbs a rope time again, over and over again, pulling people down off that cliff. And he becomes one of the most decorated of his unit. But he never picked up a gun. Middle of a war zone, never picked up a gun.
And we're getting questions in chat.
Yep.
Hacksaw Ridge.
Yeah, I think that makes the movie.
Yeah. Hacksaw Ridge. There it is. Thank you, Thomas. It's actually a really amazing.
And Mountains of Elysium.
Yeah, it's a really amazing story, and it is a lot of factual base. And so they definitely did find their roles, but there were some that even under that persecution per se, you could call it that, because the nation's at war. Why are you not? Because I don't believe in it. And people took that quite literally, and even in a setting of World War II, they still, the belief was strong enough that even with people shooting at you, because the old joke is, well, if somebody's shooting at you, you'll pick up a gun. No. there
Not
are
everyone.
people that are brave enough to go, no. Then they shoot me. It's just the way it is. So I think what we'll do is we'll let you have final thoughts, sum it all up, and then we'll close off for the day.
Just one more thing about the whole fighting aspect is that in the modern day, typically people who have these beliefs can get a conscientious objector status if they can, basically prove that this is a deeply held belief and not just something they made up on the spot to get out of military service.
Yes.
Yes. But anyway, I appreciate you letting me be up here on the panel and talk about this stuff. I know it's
Absolutely not a problem.
this is probably dry for some people.
But
enjoy talking about it.
it's good because it's a different side of history. We always talk about World War II, World War One, Nam, Korea. There are other aspects to history, and they're just as fascinating and sometimes more brutal in some senses.
And you start to see how things tie together.
Yes.
When you bring in these other aspects of history. So
Yep.
we thank you for coming on, John, and talking about this.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And you probably made Mr. CCDV's day. He's in his glory. But with that, I will say thank you to everyone in chat, and of course to my tag team partner in this, Jeff Franklin, and John. Thank you for coming. And
John.
I hope that this has been able to, spark an interest. Maybe somebody will pick up a book and look into the differences, look into the different religions, even if you're a non-believer, take a look at the differences and why, and you'll start to see why certain things are the way they are. It's really interesting to see how the split of the church from one to many denominations really impacted the world's history. And what we're still feeling the effects of some of it to this day. Mountains pointed out that the move that King Henry VIII did is still felt in Ireland, and we're in 2021. So it is very. It is very, very different. Couple of side notes. Thursday morning, 10:55, Jeff and I will be back for History with R&R Remembers. It is Remembrance Day on the 11th. We will go at 10:55 so that the moment of silence, 10:55 Central, so that the moment of silence can be held at the traditional time of 11 o'clock. We'll have a few panelists that day, and we'll remember those who fought so that we can bicker over shows and all the other wonderful things we bicker about. Because those men and women died so that we can do so. So we shall pay our respects on Thursday. There will be no roundtable this week. So I'll come up with something else for Friday. Next week, Friday, we will have Mr. CCDV return for episode 2. Also, I would like to say a big thank you to anyone that was at the History with R&R Rambling Canucks. I'll get my brain right yet. Rambling Canucks karaoke last Saturday. It was a special karaoke for my Love Mary game room. She's doing a 24-hour live stream coming up on the 19th and the 20th to raise funds for Children's Hospital.
Awesome.
So we were able to raise $195 on Saturday. So a big thank you to everybody who was there. A big thank you to everybody who donated. There were some T-shirts given away, some stickers, and a mug, and it was a crazy night. It was an awesome fundraiser. We did really well. Mary will be doing her 24-hour live stream starting on the 19th, and there'll be lots of games. Mark might get cut, a few things. And with that, thank you, and good night.